I don't think most of us would consider Frank Sinatra to be a great theologian, but I do find that in at least one particular song that was a great hit in 1965, he sang it in D minor. It was a very good year. You may or may not remember that song, but the last stanza began something like this, and now the days are short. It is the autumn of the year, and as I think of my life as vintage wine from fine old kegs, from the brim to the dregs, it pours sweet and clear. It was a very good year. And when I heard those lines, not that long ago, I began to think about my own life and what I'll refer to again as gospel stewardship, in terms of how well am I serving my Lord in terms of my personal life and ministry. About 5 years ago, Debbie and I reached what we refer to as our 60-40 window. Our 60-40 window meant that we reached age 60 and 40 years of marriage, and now we're, again, 5 years post that mark. And it was a reminder to me that we had gone through the first season of our life, which was, the upbringing and school and all that. And then you enter into post, for us, seminary days and into ministry. And that's the middle season. And then you all of a sudden find that you're in the autumn of the year. You're entering into that final season. And as I did so, I began to become a bit more haunted by the question of gospel stewardship. Was I functioning? Was I thinking? Was I ministering in a way that was really in concert with my Lord? And I ended up with a number of questions that I continue to ask myself in regards to ministry. And I wonder if some of these same questions might be somewhat applicable to the church at large. And the first question in regards to gospel ministry was simply this: do I have the same mindset as that of my Lord? Again, pertaining to myself in terms of ministry, you'll recall in Matthew chapter 16 that Peter had rebuked Jesus after after Jesus had shared about the most significant event in all of redemptive history, where Jesus said to the disciples he was going to suffer and he was going to die and he was going to be resurrected. And Peter's response to that was, that will never happen to you, Lord. And then Jesus turns to Peter and he says to him, get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of man. And when I think about what Jesus was saying to Peter, and Peter's concern was simply that the ministry that they had engaged in would continue, but clearly Peter's thinking and his thought life, his processes, so to speak, in terms of his view of ministry was totally off-centered in regards to what Christ was doing. And I wonder, in terms of my life, and again, coming to the autumn of the year, if I am in concert with what Jesus is thinking in regards to ministry. And let me be a little bit more specific here. For much of my ministry life, in terms of serving the church as a pastor, I was involved in what I'll refer to as passive ministry. Passive ministry meaning that you establish a worship community, and people will come. It's sort of like if you build it, they'll come. And I engaged in that for a long time, but I realized in time that that would not be adequate in regards to reaching the community and the culture and the people at large in terms of my sphere of ministry. And one of the reasons why I had to begin to think about something like ministry to state was because I realized that the numbers simply are not there in regards to convincing myself that passive ministry is as effective as it needs to be. And so I realized that when I looked at the gospel and I looked at Acts, I saw this continual pattern of the disciples being discipled and then carrying out that form of ministry where they were going out into their world and they weren't going to be satisfied with what I would call passive ministry. Passive ministry is important. We need to have that aspect of our work. But there needs to be what I would refer to now as smart ministry. And the work that we have been engaged in, or I've been engaged in for the last 15 years, is a ministry where you say, yes, the church is incredibly important and its worship is important, but it's absolutely essential that we realize that there are so many people in our community that will never be reached by a passive form of ministry alone and need a gospel-centered outreach where you're going into the workplace, you're going into the educational part of the community, you're going into the recreational and many other aspects of community with the gospel, but realizing that those people will never be reached by a passive form only. So this aspect or the question of, do I have in mind the things of Christ continues to haunt me in regards to my overall question of stewardship. The second question which relates to it that I have to ask myself in terms of gospel stewardship is that in terms of, what shall we say, sticker shock, Jesus sticker shock in regards to what it cost to do that kind of ministry. Later on in that same passage in Matthew 16, after Jesus rebuked Peter, then he told the disciples that really the way of ministry in life is death, death to self. Unless you're willing to die, pick up your cross, in essence, Jesus says, that it's not going to work. And I have found over the years, and having completed not quite 40 years of ministry, that this ongoing call of dying to self is something that I've got to face every single day. There are aspects to it that I don't like. I find that when I see how expensive it has been for us to move to DC and what that meant for my family and my children, and at times the gut-wrenching parts of it, and again, having been there for 15 years, I realized that what I'll call, again, smart ministry is incredibly expensive. And just ministering in the church is difficult. But going through the process of dying to self is not easy. I recall that Winston Churchill would say, this is specifically during the war, that each night as he would retire, he would ask himself in regards to his effectiveness of the day. And he would say something like, I'm placing myself as if I'm being court-martialed. And the question is, have I been effective today? And he goes on, he says, not just pawing around is the terms that he uses, but actually being effective. And to me, as I read the gospel, I see that the only way that I can be effective in terms of ministry is to be so oriented towards the gospel that I'm willing and I'm glad to die to self. The third question, though, that hits me in regards to the whole issue of stewardship is my relationship to the bride. Sometimes I put the question like this, do I love well the wife of another? And I know that sounds a little bit odd, but specifically, do I love well the bride of Christ? I believe that for effective ministry within our culture today, within our world, that the church is indeed very central to that. And good ministry needs to come out of the church, out of the local church. I also acknowledge that as I spend time with my friends who've been in the pastorate, people who are just members of the church, that sometimes this wife, the bride of Christ, can be very, very difficult to be around. We can get stung. There are times where we don't feel encouraged, where we feel neglected, where we find ourselves at odds with her. But she is absolutely critical because she's the one that Christ has died for. And I believe that if I don't love her well, that I don't have a good position to work out of in regards to communicating the gospel in terms of the church or in terms of the world at large. And then the last question simply pertains to humility. When I think about what it means to engage in this question, ongoing question of stewardship in the gospel, I think about the fact that there really isn't much that we have to offer the world unless we see the nature of our sin and who we are. When Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount speaks about the need to own the fact that we are poor, and when he talks about blessed are the poor in spirit, meaning that it begins, our relationship with Christ always begins with seeing our incredible need, our incredible offense to God, our sin. And I think if you had asked me when I was a young Christian back in the high school days and college, what it would look like for me, at the age of 60, again in the autumn of the year, I would have probably said, well, probably by then, I'll have matured and my sanctification will be so that I won't, hardly sin at all, and I'll just be, almost perfect and ready for heaven type of thing. Well, the truth is, at this stage in my life, as I think about who I am, I think about, again, the Sermon on the Mount, I realize I see more of my sin today. I'm more haunted by my inability to be obedient, to really love Christ, to love his church well, to engage in the kind of ministry that I think he wants me to. In other words, I see my sin more. And later on in the Sermon on the Mount, when he talks about blessed are those who mourn, we need to mourn. We need to see the depth of our insult and our offense to God. And I think as a church, what the world needs to see, perhaps more than anything else, is a transparent church that really owns and sees her sin. I think that as a denomination, and I realize that this is somewhat sensitive, but in terms of our discipline, I think that we ought at least on an annual basis as a General Assembly report the fact that this past year we've had this many discipline cases, not names, not churches, but certainly the general nature of our sin and the frequency and the fact that as a group of elders, we are transparent with our sin. Not an easy topic, but I think if the world were to see the fact that we are struggling with our sin, and it's only through the gospel that it can be addressed. It's only through the grace of our Lord that our ability to minister would be perhaps increased. So I can't speak for other people, but I just know that in my own life that those words of Frank Sinatra, now as I think of my life, I'm in the autumn of the year, when he talks about that fine wine, that I think about what Paul says in Philippians 2, where he says, I pour myself out as a drink offering. That drink offering was wine. Am I willing to be poured out as a drink offering? Am I willing in this final season of my life? I don't know how long it will last, but I pray that it would, in essence, bring glory to my Lord, and that I would be a steward of the gospel in a way that would be well-pleasing, not so much to me, but to Christ.